Hey guys. Oh, I miss you. Time for our Monday Bible study. I know you guys are used to doing this at 1 o'clock and 7 o'clock, but I'm going to go with 11 o'clock for now. And, since we're still just doing it online, and then it'll be recorded and it'll be on our Facebook page, and I'll put it on the website and our YouTube channel also. That way you can follow along. So in the Old Testament, we are presented with a unique picture of God. He interacts with, guides, and sometimes punishes his people in direct ways that we often don't see or recognize today. At the beginning of Judges, we see Israel at a difficult crossroads. As they enter the promised land, they're faced with tough choices. Many of those they make poorly. So we're going to get our Bible study started on the book of Judges. And one of the things that I found interesting about this study was they compare it to superheroes. And I mean, who doesn't love a good superhero story? According to Hollywood, apparently the answer is nobody. Billions of dollars are spent each year on the superhero industry in the form of movies, video games, and comic books. There's something compelling about a human using their powers to help those in need. It's hard not to watch the news and wish that superheroes were real. Sometimes it's easy to think of the Bible as just a rule book compared to the thrilling movies that Marvel and DC Comics have been putting out. And this rule book can seem kind of boring. The reality is, the Bible contains so many exciting stories that make even the biggest Hollywood blockbusters seem like a snooze fest. Did you know that the Bible actually contains some of the oldest superhero stories, where humans will use their superpowers to fight injustice and save people in need? And in this study, we're going to be diving into one of the most intriguing and thrilling books of the Bible, the book of Judges. It has all the elements of a great movie. It has action, tragedy, love, and loss. It's a story of God's amazing power poured out through his Spirit and through his people. It's a story of human victory and failure. But most of all, it's a story of God's incredible and enduring love for us. But you're also going to see an untamed God that can't tolerate sin and evil. And he holds his people accountable for their sins, punishing them when they break their promises. But he never abandons them to their deserved fate. The book of Judges is a collection of stories about the heroes that God raised up to save his people, even when they didn't deserve it. Now, to best understand the way that God interacts with his people in the book of Judges, we need to kind of step back and look at Israel's history. Less than 100 years before our saga begins, the Israelites lived under the cruel fist of the Egyptian Pharaoh. They were slaves. They were treated as property with no rights and little hope for the future. God raised up Moses to set them free. And almost immediately, they seemed to forget all that God had already done and began worshiping false idols. And this is foreshadowing of what's going to come throughout their history. God led them to the promised land. There were already kings and kingdoms occupying this wonderful land. But God promised the Israelites that all would be theirs if they just followed his commands. Yeah. After wandering in the desert for 40 years, the Israelites, under the leadership of their second hero, Joshua, finally entered this promised land. And in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 to 18, we catch our first glimpse of the untamed God. It says, "However, in the cities of the nations, the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. Do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise, they'll be teaching you to follow all of the detestable things that they do in worshiping their gods, and you'll sin against the Lord your God. Can you believe that? He says, kill anything that breathes. This command may seem kind of harsh, especially to our modern sensibilities. But before we make the mistake of seeing the Judeo-Christian God as barbaric, we need to remember that this was, of course, a very different and unique time in our world history. It's also important to note that there were provisions that were made to spare those who surrendered willingly. Still, the Israelites were given clear instructions on how they were to conquer the land that God had given to them. I mean, why would God want them to do this? Well, he knew that if he allowed those people to live, they would be corrupted by the foreign religions and practices. Very long story short, the Israelites failed to follow God's commands. Not only did they allow the indigenous people of Canaan to live, but they intermarried and they immediately began adopting their practices and even their religions. And the worship of these false gods became the foundation for sin, evil practices, and ultimately the destruction of Israel as a nation. In the downward spiral from Deuteronomy 20:16 verses 18, we see the clear instructions that God gave the people of Israel. If they obeyed him, their victory was guaranteed. This didn't happen. And Judges picks up right after the death of Joshua. Moses, who led Israel out of slavery, passed the mantle of leadership directly to Joshua, who had been there from the beginning. And after Moses died, there was a vacuum left, one that caused immediate problems. Israel was always supposed to be a theocracy, and the problems began when Israel saw themselves more as human-led. And so right away in Judges chapter 1, verses 19 to 36, we see that downward spiral begin. There's a number of military figures, but that's not the worst of it. Israel allows the temples and the altars of false gods to remain, effectively allowing the worship of these idols to continue. I mean, this is in direct violation of the command that's given in Deuteronomy 20, where they make treaties and agreements with the people that they're supposed to be conquering. Sin is given a foothold. And then in Judges chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, we see God's response to these failures. The angel of the Lord appears and says, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land that I swore to give to your forefathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not make a covenant with other people of this land. You shall break down their altars. Yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? Now, Israel has clearly violated God's command here. I mean, this isn't about failed battles. This isn't about making small mistakes. Everyone messes up. God isn't cruel, but the Israelites, starting as early as those first days out of Egypt, have set a pattern of disrespect and disregard of God. And even though he's already rescued them time and time again, they settle for cheap substitutes, ones that aren't even real. These failures and sins, well, they lead to consequences. And in Judges chapter 2, verse 3, the angel continues, says, now therefore I tell you that I will not drive them out before you. They will be thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. God held up his end of the agreement. He provided for his people in the desert. He gave them victory when they would have been defeated without him. Now that they've made their choice, God says that he's no longer going to do their work for them. They've allowed their enemies to have a foothold. And these enemies will become the proverbial thorn in their side. Not surprisingly, because the Israelites allowed the false idols and temples to stay, their spiritual core begins to crumble. And according to Judges chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped various gods of the peoples around them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. Israel's turning to these false gods leads us to the beginning of our superhero saga in Judges chapter 2, verse 14, where it says, "In his anger against Israel, the Lord handed them over to the raiders who plundered them. He sold them to their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist." You know, the Old Testament's depiction of God can sometimes seem to clash with that wonderful, loving Jesus we see in the New Testament. God has never changed, nor will he ever. He's the same God today as he was in the Old Testament. But that being said, he is a God of justice, and he cannot tolerate evil and sin. In fact, he is the water to evil's oil. And we all know that those don't mix in any way. This picture of God, one that sees him ordering the death of everyone in Canaan, the one that gives a disobedient Israel over to her enemies, is exactly what I'm talking about when I say that he's not tame. And Israel is the classic example of what happens when we try to mold God into our image. He can't compromise. He's too pure. He's too good. Now, that's not to say that he's cruel. I mean, he gave Israel chance after chance after chance. Even when they were punished throughout Judges, we see them being drawn to mercy in their suffering and their cries for help. But sin cannot coexist with God. And there are always consequences for our actions. But it's important to remember that God is also a God of love. And it's this love that led to the creation of his superheroes in the era of the Judges. And it's this love that led him to ultimately send the perfect hero to die in our place. Judges 2:14 leaves us with Israel being handed over to her enemies. It was their just reward for all the evil that they had done. God had every right to end their story and to move on to plan B. And if the story would have ended here, it would have been a tremendous tragedy. Once again, mankind messed up God's perfect plan and had to pay the price. Israel knew that plan, and they chose their own path. And their path led to destruction. Case closed, game over. But that's not how it ends. God listens to their cries for help. He shows tremendous love and amazing grace and abundant mercy. And he raised up 12 heroes to save the people that he loves. God is just, but he's also a little wild. His way may seem hard to some, but he cannot tolerate evil. It's against his very nature. So Israel learned this lesson the hard way, time and time again. Despite all their failures, despite the fact that they spit in his face and they turned away from him, God never responded in kind. He never gave up on them. He never walked away. So in this study over the next few weeks, we're going to see how God chose to raise up heroes to save the people that he loved, despite the fact that they didn't really deserve it. God has a way, has a plan for our lives. And when we disobey him, there are often consequences. Sometimes we have thorns that remain in our lives just as the Israelites did. But no matter what we do, God never abandons us. Jesus became the ultimate hero. He is the completion of all that the book of Judges was meant to show us. I want to offer up a prayer for us right now. So will you all pray with me? Lord, we thank you for your faithfulness that is so evident in your word. You watched over the Israelites despite their unfaithfulness. You raised up judges whom you strengthened to keep delivering your people from their own folly. But whenever the judge died, the Israelites went back to their old ways. And yet you did not stop raising up judges for them despite their stubbornness. Such is your faithfulness. You continue to save and deliver in spite of your anger towards them, and we thank you for your undying love. Amen. Okay, guys, so that's it for today. I will see you next week, and we're going to learn about a guy named Othniel. So I can't wait to see you all next week. And don't forget, if you missed this whole thing, you can catch it on Facebook or our YouTube channel or on the website. All right, have a great time, guys. See you later.